present on the 3Rs Ambassador Program, and then we'll do a Q&A after. So I know a lot of municipalities are really interested in this type of a program, an ambassador program in their buildings to help with multi-res diversions. So I'm looking forward to this presentation as well. So I'll hand it over to you. Trevor, I'm assuming you need to provide permission to Alexander to share.
Yeah, Alan, or I'm sorry, Alexander, I've given you the permissions to share the screen. Are you able to do that?
Okay. Yeah, I'm just setting that up now.
Can we use Zoom rather than Teams? And it's a bit confusing, I know, and I apologize.
Well, that's all good. All right, so you should see a title slide. Is that correct?
Yes, we do.
Okay, perfect. So I'll just turn my video on for a moment here, introduce myself. But it says my bandwidth's low, so I'll just say hello like this, and then I'll move on so that we can see all the content and not me as well. All right, so let me know if I need to speak up any louder. I might not be able to see the chat at the same time, but I'm happy to take questions throughout if something doesn't make sense, but I'm sure we'll have lots of time for questions at the end as well. So for this presentation, I'll be providing an overview of the program, the application and training process, metrics involved in the program, as well as the 3Rs Ambassador impact has on waste diversion and reduction. We'll go through the best practices that we've seen in buildings over the years, and we'll discuss some program enhancements that are underway or developing right now. So just to situate this information, the impetus for this program has been the difference between the multi-residential waste diversion and single-family waste diversion, which I'm sure you're all very familiar with. And we'll be focusing on the left side of this pie chart with the multi-residential customers that the City of Toronto has. And if Renee was on the call, she'll be able to provide a more exact number, but the City of Toronto collects from approximately 55% of the multi-residential buildings in the City of Toronto. For an overview of the program, I'm sure many people are briefly familiar, but for more information, this is a program that partners with multi-residential residents to work with their building manager to educate other residents in their building on the importance of waste reduction and diversion. So this is really a partnership with the city. They receive training from city staff, support and resources. As well, we provide things such as printed resources. We can share information and link ambassadors with one another so they can share information between them, help them prepare information for their building, newsletters, content, as well as some of the best practices that we'll be talking about as well. And the homepage for this program is on our website, toronto.ca/3Rs. So like I mentioned, this is a formal partnership. So through the city, this is a waivered program. There's municipal regulations that apply to this, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But essentially, this is someone who has, in most cases, self-identified as wanting to address waste diversion in their building and applied to the program. So what we're able to provide is education to these people that have self-identified to help provide information to other people in their building. So kind of train the trainer community network dissemination of information. So to raise awareness about the city's waste management programs and services, because it was identified that the city can have campaigns and public information available, but getting that information from someone that's already in your social network or someone that's especially in your building that you already know is coming from a much different, it's interpreted much differently than if it's just coming from the city's website or the waste management guide that we mail out. So this is someone that's in these buildings that can encourage other residents to reduce waste and participate in all the waste diversion programs that the city has, which would be a requirement of being on city collection in a multi-residential building to participate in all these programs. As well, we ask to maintain regular communication with building staff, residents, as well as with the city. So we'll cover in a little bit about the numbers of ambassadors over the years, and I'll touch on that communication aspect again. So this is really a position that requires a lot of collaboration between and being a liaison between city staff, building staff, and other residents in the building, with, of course, the ultimate goal to reduce waste and reduce contamination and increase waste diversion. And you know, being municipal staff, I'm sure that you're interested in the amount of staffing that this program requires. It'd be great if it was completely self-sufficient, but of course we have to provide oversight and guidance to all the volunteers that we have. So the 3 Hours Ambassador Program is managed by currently full-time 2 coordinators working 35 hours a week, and they work approximately 90% of what they spend their time on is related to the 3 Hours Program administration, with some non-3 Hours outreach duties as needed. But of course, these are things that can be they do have synergies with the program. So if it's an outreach event at like a library or community center, or perhaps like a waste related event, we do recruit a lot of ambassadors at those type of events. So some of that 10% that's not directly related to the program still does benefit the program. At times, this program has been managed by up to 4 coordinators, and that's kind of shown in the amount of volunteers that we have. And I can talk about that in a little bit as well. The 3 Hours Program development is overseen by 1 full-time project lead, which is myself, working 35 hours a week. So approximately 30% of my time is spent on the long-term development of the program, and about 20% assisting with operations. But as I've been recently onboarding staff, I think that 20% will be lower as well. So approximately 80.5 staffing hours per week total for this program at present. So this program has moved a little bit over the years, but the original idea for the program actually came from a U of T student report that was presented to the then Community Environmental Assessment team. And then this was a kind of like a working group at the city. This was split into a residual waste working group and a 3 Hours working group, and the development of a 3 Hours Ambassador Program was made a top priority as a recommendation from this program before it was this working group before it was disbanded. The first 3 Hours Program coordinator was hired in the end of 2009, and the first 3 Hours Ambassador to complete training and signed waivers was in early 2010. And then up until 2012, this program was managed in the original unit, which would eventually become the section that it's in now with solid waste policy and planning. But from 2013 to 2019, the program moved to a more operations section with solid waste. And this was partly due to the rollout of the green bin in multi-residential buildings, and so it was kind of it made more sense for it to be involved in that rollout. With COVID in 2020, the program was placed on hiatus. We had to provide direction on essentially not advising any volunteer activities for the first bit of the pandemic, but that hiatus allowed us to move the program back to the solid waste policy and planning, solid waste policy and outreach. So this was to streamline the delivery of outreach efforts across the division. So now it's in the stakeholder and community outreach unit, my unit. So it has synergies with other outreach efforts that the city does in solid waste. So this is a look at the program size over time, and I would pay special attention to the difference between the active ambassadors and the buildings enrolled. So in 2017, 2019, 2021, you see that there's quite quite a lot more ambassadors than buildings. And this was in part due to the outreach that was being done with programs related to the Mayor's Towering Waste Challenge, as well as the rollout of the long-term waste management strategy, and specifically recruiting inside of buildings where we already had one ambassador. So there was a focus on getting more ambassadors, not necessarily more buildings. And so you see that difference there. Versus the first few years of the program, it was pretty much pretty close together. There was one ambassador per building. And I think that was the initial idea of the program, was to have one representative in the building, and they might work with other people in their building, but there would be one kind of point person to the city. I mentioned earlier that one of the responsibilities of the ambassador is to maintain regular communication with the city. And so in the end of 2021, we did an audit where we contacted every ambassador and we spoke with them and made sure that they were still wanting to actively engage in the program. And given the time of the pandemic, perhaps in hindsight, that might have been premature, because we did get a lot of people that were no longer interested in volunteering, in part due to the pandemic. And also so many people moved during the pandemic as well. So we did find out that people maybe moved out of the city, or they moved to another building that was no longer eligible. So this is partly why you see this drop in ambassadors. We had a lot of people that left the program in that audit. But as you can also see, the number of buildings from 2021 to 2022 didn't drop too much. And that was partly because a lot of the people that were leaving the program were leaving because they knew that someone else in the building was still an ambassador and could still speak with the city. So the numbers for the last few years have been perhaps more reflective of the people that are actually volunteering versus the people that have received training in the past and are that we have once counted as ambassadors. In terms of the retention of ambassadors, this is a breakdown of the years of service. So as you can see, there's about a dozen people that have been around since almost the very beginning, which is amazing. And we do have a big chunk of people that are coming from 6, 7, 8, 9 years of service. And again, these are in tandem with other other multi-residential solid waste management outreach campaigns. So the Mayor's Towering Waste Challenge would be this 7-year, and then the long-term waste management strategy outreach would have been that 8-year. So getting quite a bit of people with recruiting a lot of volunteers when you're doing other outreach activities as well is the point I'd want to make on this slide. In terms of the application process and training, so residents apply to the program Self-Identify using our online application system, and program coordinators then will check this application for eligibility. So the two main factors would be that it's actually a multi-residential building, which would be 9 units or more. According to Solid Waste Management Services, this is how we make the differentiation. We have trained people that are in buildings with 7 or 8 units. The only issue is that with a smaller building, if you have maybe one resident out of 10 that's not on board, it could really kind of dampen the volunteer experience versus like a larger building. Even if only 20% of residents are able to really make a difference in how they're sorting waste on the aggregate level, it can make a big difference for the building. So smaller buildings are more challenging, but we do still accept people that are in these smaller buildings. As well, the building has to receive city waste collection services. So if they're on private collection, we don't have the oversight. We don't have they might not accept the same items. And so that's not, we don't recruit people as eligible if they're not on city service. One of the difficulties with this is if people leave city service, that can be a difficult conversation to have, that they're no longer an ambassador. And many times buildings will leave city service and they won't necessarily tell all residents that that's happened. So that can be an unfortunate situation. If someone's ineligible, the applicant sent an email confirmation with other programs and resources. So the Live Green Toronto volunteer program as well. There's a Sustainable Towers Engaging People program, which is a bit more specific to rental buildings of a certain age, but can still be of benefit to waste diversion. As well, if someone is eligible, they're sent an invitation to register for an upcoming training session, and eligible applicants are notified that they must receive approval from the building management. We don't ask for like written permission, partly because we know that property managers are very busy and this might cause undue delays. But we do want to set the expectation early that if they don't have approval from building management, it'll be very difficult to implement some of the changes that they'll learn about in the training. So we want to set that expectation early. In terms of the training, for the last couple of years, what we've been doing is a 2-part virtual training that's completed prior to beginning volunteer activities. Part 1 provides a detailed overview of the city's waste system and the difficulties behind waste sorting. This would include a lot of things that we would have in a general education presentation, but just a bit longer and in-depth for the ambassadors. As well, part 2 covers their specific volunteer roles and responsibilities and some of the best practices that we'll cover in this presentation later today. We have tried to include as many interactive elements to encourage participation and engagement as possible, but of course with a virtual, this is really you get out of it what you put into it type of situation. And so some months will have very high engagement and other months you'll kind of hope that you're talking to someone because there's little engagement. So that is the risk of doing the virtual training. It's a little bit less administrative of a burden, but in terms of the impact of it, it is what people put into it versus in person. People might not actually show up to an in-person training unless they're willing to pay attention and get the most out of it. And I'll mention here that we're currently looking at adapting the training to perhaps do it in a shorter format or do it less often so that we can have more in-person versions of the training. But given staffing over the last few years, we've done it on the virtual basis just to allow as many people to do it on a monthly basis as possible. But we might switch this over to being less frequently than a monthly training. After the training, people who are sent a volunteer waiver, and this is something that kind of solidifies that they are volunteering and representing the City of Toronto, which would be a different relationship than representing a nonprofit organization. That's not the city, so they have to adhere to different policies that the city has. And so that's why the waiver is there for them to review and sign. And once they've signed that waiver, we send them a building assessment form, different survey templates, and a waste reduction and diversion task list. And I'm just gonna pop my window up. Ryan or Trevor, if you have any questions or there's anything in the chat, you can just let me know and I can speak to it. But otherwise, I'll just keep going.
I haven't seen anything in the chat.
Okay, great, thank you. So in terms of the program metrics, some different information about the buildings that we have. I'll go through this next bit a little quicker, but I'm happy to answer more questions later. This is just a look at the number of enrolled buildings based on the wards in the city. And so we don't see a very even distribution. We have most of our buildings in the downtown area and then kind of like a more concentrated area in North York Center where there's a lot of condo towers. But if you look at the census data, these are the areas of Toronto that have a higher than average density and also population in living in apartments of 5 or more stories. These are the wards that would have just a higher average density. And then these would be the lower density. So in those blue ones, we would not expect to see very many ambassadors or that many buildings that would be eligible. But for the yellow ones, we should expect to see more than we actually have in the program right now. So it's something to think about in terms of the areas of your city or your municipality that would have buildings that would be eligible. And if you wanted to do kind of recruitment based on having it be equally accessible. But this is just where we're finding people have self-identified as wanting to be in the program is a bit different than what we would expect if we looked at the census information, for instance. For the 3R ambassador building types, we usually see a bigger size of buildings related to other buildings that are on city service. So like I mentioned, it's a bit easier to implement the program in a larger building than it is a smaller building. And so that's part of this is the people that stay in the program that we're able to continue to count is the larger building. So almost 3/4 is in larger high-rise buildings, and this would be 7 or more floors is the definition there. And then in terms of the collection type, most of them are on front-end collection, again, associated with the larger buildings, but we do have 14% of the buildings, ambassador buildings, that are receiving curbside collection. And relative to all multi-residential customers, it's about 55% of all of our multi-res customers are on front end. So over-representing the front end customers are ambassador buildings. Now, another really important aspect here is that there is quite a difference in terms of how the program gets implemented and the success of the program, depending on the property type. So if a resident is in a condominium or a co-op, especially if they're an owner in a condominium, they have a lot more leverage and ability to have their say in how the building is run versus in a rental building. This is not necessarily the relationship. So the other part of this is that people that are in condos and co-ops will probably stay in those units longer than someone that's in Toronto community housing or rental building. And so while we do get applications for rental buildings, a lot less of those buildings will be eligible because they're not on city service. As well, people in rental buildings will leave that building more often. So thinking back to the years of service, we're more likely to have someone not stay in the program as long if they're in a rental building. But for a cooperative or in a condominium, these are the building types where people will be able to stay in the program longer, basically because they've continued to live there. The condominiums and the cooperatives are overrepresented in the 3Rs program compared to what we have on city service. So about 31% of our front-end customers are condominiums, but here it's 52%. And for our front-end customers, about 5% are cooperatives, but here it's 10%. In terms of the 3Rs ambassador impact, this information is coming from the multi-residential building audits from 2020 to 2022. And as these audits are not set up specifically to compare between the 3Rs ambassador program buildings and ones that aren't, these are just inferences that we're able to make. So it's not a perfect comparison, so keep that in mind. And the sample is, the data is very good because it's an in-depth waste audit, but the sample's small because we're only comparing a couple buildings in terms of ones that have 3Rs ambassadors versus ones that don't. So in terms of the average waste diversion percentage, a 3Rs ambassador condo, the average waste diversion was 40.33% versus a non-3Rs condo was 30.58%. And then a 3Rs co-op was over 45% waste diversion, and there wasn't a non-3Rs co-op to compare in this sample. So, but you can see relative to rental buildings and Toronto community housing buildings, it's significantly higher as well. Thinking back to that waste diversion number from the beginning, it's higher than it's high. Both the 3Rs buildings are significantly higher than that 26%. Was that 26%? Yeah, sorry, 28% here. So both the 3Rs buildings are significantly higher than that 28% that we saw. In terms of recovery rates, again, the 3Rs condo is outperforming the non-3Rs condo with a 63% recovery rate on average for Blue Bin, and then relative to 53%, so about 10% more. And then for organics, it is 33% for the 3Rs condo, 21% for the non-3Rs condo, and 30% for the 3Rs condo. The recovery rate on average for the recycling for the co-op was really high, 76%, which is quite an outlier based on these other building types. Okay, so in terms of best practices, we found that for building a successful long-term waste diversion program, it's important to have the support and involvement from as many different stakeholders as possible. So condo or co-op boards, relevant committees, property management, superintendents, and building staff. So I'm a big basketball fan, so excuse this analogy, but it's kind of like a basketball team. You can't have all people that have all the same skills. Otherwise, it'll be a pretty easy team to defeat. So everyone has different strengths, and working together as a team, you're able to be greater than the sum of your parts because of the different things that you're able to bring to the table. There's a City of Toronto. So in terms of best practices for education and outreach, we found that establishing a greener waste diversion committee, designated of floor representatives, and having a 3R ambassador impact as the point person is highly successful in buildings. If it's just one ambassador working alone, trying to coordinate with all the residents and with the property management, that can maybe be a bit overwhelming. And there's some people, personality types that would love that, but it can be overwhelming for some. So having the 3Rs ambassador be the point person with the city at least, and then having them be on a team, waste diversion committee or green team, this is something that we found very, very helpful for buildings. Planning contests, games, prizes to engage residents to participate in any of the outreach events and activities, as well as having the 3Rs ambassador and other residents bring a waste diversion element to any of the events that would be happening at a building. Engaging in regular communication, updates to other residents using social media, building display boards, elevator screens, and direct conversations. New residents having a welcome package and tour of waste storage and disposal locations, as well as posting specific information in appropriate places. For this, it's really important to note, I think, that getting a building from a place where the waste diversion program isn't really being optimized at all to get to a better place, that is where kind of all of the legwork goes in. Once a building is already at a place that's doing pretty well, it's way easier to maintain it than it is to get there in the first place. So that's one of the things that the welcome package does, is kind of set that expectation. For really high performing buildings, they do tours with residents when they move in. And so they can kind of get a sense of like what some of the social expectations are. With multi-residential buildings, there's always the issue of anonymity. So just being able to dispose of things, and it kind of erodes that connection you might have with your neighbors that you might have otherwise. And so setting that social expectation early is really helpful to make sure that people are participating to the level that the building's already at. In terms of building setup, having the waste disposal, collection, and storage areas be as accessible and convenient, well-maintained, tidy, clearly lit, relatively low odors, and have clear signage. This just makes it so that if people do need to take a second to think about where something goes, they are actually spending 30 seconds there rather than just going in, dumping something and running away because it's so gross in there. Or not even, maybe even going into the room because they're afraid of it or it's too gross for them. So they'll just leave bags outside of the door or in a common area. Superintendents and building staff regularly checking bins for contamination and are well informed of what goes where. And thinking back to that team picture, having the superintendent be on board is very important. They're going to have the most hands-on knowledge of what's happening in the building. And so if they see a trend or things are changing, this is something that they're able to work with the ambassador or building staff to other building staff to help address. One of the things that's in our volunteer waiver is that ambassadors are not instructed to sort waste for other residents for health and safety considerations, but also because sorting someone's waste after they've already disposed of it isn't going to change their behavior in the future. So it's kind of like being on kind of like a treadmill. It's not going to go anywhere. The 3 R's ambassador or waste diversion team establishing a baseline and tracking the garbage, recycling, organic waste volumes over time. For front-end buildings, the city provides lift reports on a by request basis, but we encourage 3 R's ambassadors to request this information as well. And we do include information for doing like a visual assessment of bins if that's something that residents have access to.
Alexander, we do have a question.
Yeah.
Ready to
Okay.
we're up.
Yeah.
Virginia was asking how many condo and co-op buildings used for assessing impact with waste audits?
Yeah, so that's a great question. In terms of the waste audits, those would just be rolled into the ones that the city would be doing anyway on like a biannual basis. So that's why I was including the information from the 2020 to 2022 multi-residential waste audits. So these would be happening over, they don't usually happen over 2 years, but because of the pandemic, that was over 2 years, but it would be over 4 different seasons at those buildings. So because there was 3 R's ambassador buildings involved in that process, that's why that audit information is available. If a 3 R's ambassador building wasn't included in that audit, then we wouldn't have waste audit data from these buildings. We would be able to track lift report data, but because of contamination and because we're with the lift reports, we're just getting the full volume of the bin that it got picked up. Even though it might not have been full, even though it might have been contaminated, it wouldn't really be that it wouldn't be that best data to use to say, you know, this was the impact of the building versus having an ambassador versus not. We could track things like total garbage being disposed of and that impact on the waste bill, but in terms of in-depth audits of just ambassador buildings, that's not something that we've done unless they're involved in the multi-residential building waste audits that the city does biannually.
Right. So it was coincidental that you had certain buildings with 3 R's ambassadors that were included in that audit, basically.
Yeah. So yeah, the waste audit team would coordinate with our program to try to make sure that there was a building, but in terms of they would have probably other criteria that would come before that that it was a building, or let's say that they chose a building, but then the resident left the building. They're no longer technically a 3 R's ambassador building. So they'll try to include a 3 R's ambassador building, but it might not always be possible based on the other criteria. They need to have a more representative sample of multi-res buildings.
And sorry, but do you know how many of the buildings that were audited did have 3 R's ambassadors? Maybe I missed that.
In the last one, I think it was 2 or 3 of approximately 20 buildings.
Okay. And do you know if it was 2 were the co-op or 2 condo buildings and maybe 1 co-op building?
Yeah, I think that's what it was. Sorry, 2 condos, 1 co-op, I believe.
Yeah, right. Okay. And then just a second question. I guess 2 questions that are related. So Kate, hi Alexander, do you know why so many buildings are not on city waste collection? Which is a question that I was going to ask as well. Because I think you said it was around 55%. Do all city service multi-res buildings have organics collection at this point?
Yeah, so I'll answer that backwards. All city service multi-residential buildings do have organics collection, and that's actually one of the things that saw us lose the most multi-res customers, because to receive city waste collection services, the waste collection bylaw says that they're responsible for participating in all of the waste diversion programs, which would mean collecting organics. And when that became the requirement for multi-res buildings on city service, some buildings didn't want to deal with that and they left city service. The other thing is that the city the city charges for waste collection based on the volume of garbage being disposed of, and then that pays for all other services. So if a building has a lot of garbage, the cost to that building will, in order, so that's set up for us to encourage waste diversion. But if a building has a lot of garbage volume, that will make the city's cost relative to private collection pretty stark, because we have to value, we have to value the Green Lane landfill as a public asset, and so we can't. We have the volume cost set up so that if a building is disposing of a lot of garbage, we have to be compensated for that relative to a building that's not. So if a building's diverting a lot of waste, the cost of private collection relative to the services that we offer won't be nearly as enticing as a building that's disposing of a lot of garbage. They could likely get a quote for significantly less cost for waste collection, even if they won't cover the same services.
Yeah, and that makes sense. I thought maybe it was price, but it makes sense that the organics is a big piece there as well. And I know a lot of municipalities, maybe on this call, are contemplating acquiring organics in their multi-res buildings to get service, right? So it's important to know what that impact is. And then the last question I see in the chat, and then maybe we'll let you move forward in your presentation. To add to Kate's question, I was also wondering what the requirements are for city collection and what challenges, barriers may be preventing more buildings from receiving service. I think you just covered that. It's basically cost and the requirement for organics. So I think you've answered that question, unless there's another one you can think of.
I'll also just add to that because of the potential of a building not being able to be serviced by a private collector, buildings still have to meet city requirements when they're developing and redeveloping since at least 2012. I'm not sure about prior than 2012, but a building would have to meet city collection requirements in terms of being able to have a truck be able to go in without backing in and turn around. There are some exceptions to this, but that's primarily the rule. So they have to meet all the city's requirements. In the case that they can't get a private collector, they can still get city service. So they have to be eligible to receive city service for the development application to be approved, essentially.
Yeah, and I can tell you that they did do that prior to 2012 because I was with the city of Toronto reviewing development applications before then. So
that's good to know.
Yeah, I know that it was. Okay. Don't see any more questions in the chat, so please continue.
Okay, thanks. So we just have, this will be the last best practice, and then I'll talk about the ongoing program enhancements. So in terms of reduce and reuse, encouraging sharing and swap events and other locations in the building where items can be left, having a sharing shelf, building library, or an index of who's open to sharing tools or appliances. If a building has a shared and reuse space, a shared use space such as a party room, making sure that the reusable foodware items are there, can be washed and kept in a shared space. Pardon me. Organizing collection and potential reimbursement for other divertible materials which may not be collected by the city. So this would be things like a clothing donation bin on site, collecting alcoholic beverage containers. Some buildings will do this and use that money to fund social events. Other times they'll donate all of the alcoholic beverage containers to the superintendent as like a tip. And functioning electronics or electronics that they wish which require refurbishment can also be things that buildings will organize. As well, so the city would collect things such as used cooking oil, but that's also something that a building could arrange to have collected for them and have a small reimbursement as well. So in terms of the ongoing program enhancements, so moving forward, the 3 Rs program is looking to modernize and refresh the program. So this is to be aligned with the long-term waste management strategy's goal to increase waste diversion in multi-residential buildings. And this was reaffirmed by City Council in June of last year. So Council directed staff to update the long-term waste management strategy, which is happening right now, specifically to incorporate the removal of inappropriate waste out of garbage and make it consistent with some of the other city programs, as well to include strategies to get organics out of garbage stream in multi-residential buildings especially. So through this, the program enhancements, the ones that are underway already, would be to increase the amount of volunteer touch points. So in terms of thinking about that staffing element, and I'm sure being government employees at any level, if something has to come through the government, it's going to be slower than if two people are just talking to each other. So if residents are able to share information immediately, we'll facilitate that, but then that removes all of the time it would take for us to review it, approve it, etc. So it just makes it so that we don't have to necessarily be a node in all of the interactions. We can facilitate interactions between ambassadors. And so something that we have, for instance, is as a Facebook group for the ambassadors. If they want to join it, it's optional. And the information on there we're responsible for, and so we do need to moderate that. But if volunteers want to connect with each other outside of the city Facebook group, then that's something that they're able to do, is not under our purview. And then, so for instance, there's a group that have made like a WhatsApp group, and they'll go to waste reduction events together and meet up and share information. So that would be one example. But also having more volunteer touch points, such as networking opportunities, and we just recently had a recognition event where people were able to network, and just providing more of those opportunities on a yearly basis. Another thing that's underway is a program guide for staff. So having information about how to run the program on a pretty granular level be available, so that when there is staffing turnover, that we are able to kind of hit the ground running a bit better than we would if we don't have that, and it's sort of kind of like a lot of different trainings over time. So if someone has this guide, that they're able to run the program, and that might be something that's an asset to share with other municipalities once it's finished as well. It would of course be very specific to the city, but on a high level, it could be edited and shared perhaps in the future. Collaboration with Toronto Community Housing. So this is something that's already underway, and we're in part just supporting the longer transformation that they are having in terms of more resident engagement, and also having a designated waste management group that oversees their buildings. Digitizing and refining training resources to make it easier for residents to get information and to be trained on the program. And like I mentioned, having more in-person training opportunities as well. Some of the things that we're developing would be improving recruitment and retention. And so we've seen with the years of service, there was quite a lot of longer retention, but we also need to protect against the retention of buildings such as rental buildings. So one of the things that we're developing for rental buildings would be, while it is great to have a resident in a rental building self-identify as wanting to be in the program, what happens a lot of times is they're eligible, and then they don't necessarily get the greenest light. It's kind of a yellow light maybe from their property manager. But then as soon as they want to maybe make a bigger change, then the property manager anymore. So part of what we are working on is the property manager specific value proposition that we're putting out, as well as working with property management prior to recruiting an ambassador in their building. So getting a property management company on board with the program on a high level, and then recruiting in their buildings to facilitate some of the benefits that they would see, such as decreased costs for waste collection, and resident engagement as something they can claim and benefit from. As well, improving recruitment. So recruiting in buildings that we will see people being in longer, so in condos and co-ops, having more targeted recruitment to co-ops and Toronto Community Housing as well. Better data collection. So as Virginia's question highlighted, and like I was mentioning earlier, we have that waste audit data, but it's limited. so having better data for being able to make that value proposition of the benefit of a program versus not. This will help significantly in the long run to be able to make that value proposition is having the better data. As well, expanding the scope to other customers. So we are looking at piloting similar approaches where we provide a high-level overview and train a point person, and then they disseminate information in their network. So this is something that we've talked about doing with eco schools, for instance, but it could also be done for community organizations, other types of schools, and some of our non-residential customers as well. So these are some of the things that are currently underway. And with that, I am happy to answer any questions. I also put just some discussion questions if we wanted to use them, but I'm happy to answer any other questions that people might have.
Thanks so much, Alexander. Appreciate it. I have a couple of questions, but there's one more in the chat. So we'll get to that. So Lucy asks, I think I know the answer is, beyond organics collection, must buildings also be participating in the ambassador program to get city waste collection, which I don't think they do.
No, that would be a great way to have that ambassador number shoot up, would be to require that it happens. But no, they wouldn't have to participate in it. The kind of gray area there is that someone applying to the program that's on city service, there shouldn't be any issue with someone in their building helping with the things they should already be doing, essentially. So there shouldn't be an issue to someone volunteering in a building that's on city waste collection service if they're following all the requirements that they should be. But that's why we need to properly explain the program to property management that, you know, we're there as an educational resource. We're there to help them with best practices. We'll help them to lower their waste collection cost, and we're not part of an enforcement arm that's going to be auditing them and fining them.
Okay. Next question from Virginia. Have you, or I'm guessing the city of Toronto, considered making training available to volunteers in privately serviced buildings? Because you did cover that earlier in the presentation that, you know, the needed to be city service buildings.
Yeah, so it's something that we've talked about. We will, so for instance, if we work with a property management company, some of their buildings might not be on city service. So we've done presentations and training to property management staff that represent both city service and non-city service buildings. And so we do need to make a few caveats when we speak about things, and that it only really applies to city services. I think there are some high level things that a resident could do in a non-city service building, but we would just need to be very careful that the way we're presenting that information is that we wouldn't be, they couldn't come to us if there was an issue with their private collection. We wouldn't have oversight over that. And so there's a few areas that would make it difficult, but I think that we could do a better job of making public information about how to run a waste diversion reduction kind of resident focused program in a building, and then we could make that publicly available on the website. But in terms of working specifically with privately collected buildings, it's difficult, also in part because the solid waste management services is rate based. So we're all of the programs and services, the 3 R's Ambassador program, are paid for by the cost of garbage collection for our customers. So technically it would be a free service that we'd be providing to a building that wouldn't be paying specifically for solid waste collection.
Yeah. Okay. I have a couple of questions. So you had the slide up there that spoke about how many FTEs you have, you know, assigned to this program and to administer it. So I was just wondering if over time, if you think, or maybe someone there at the City of Toronto believes that the amount of staff time, if it translates into more success in this program. Obviously, COVID was an outlier, but maybe other years, you know, 80 and a half, I believe, staff hours is what you said. is considerable. So obviously City of Toronto has a lot of buildings for this type of a program, but do you think there's a linkage there?
Yeah, I mean, I think looking at the years where we've had way more ambassadors, it's kind of you could get into a situation where you recruit and then the ambassador per employee ratio gets way out of whack. When we did have those higher numbers of ambassadors, there were more coordinators, so they were able to handle that. So one of the things that we're looking at, like I mentioned with the program guide, would be that the total amount of that in that 35 hours a week for that employee, that though that time could be used more efficiently. So there's certainly some things, especially with some of the administrative part, that could be done, that could be optimized. So having that time be better used more so than necessarily having a whole other person. But we also do receive some support from other staff in our unit for things like if we were doing like a roundtable event, we would have other staff facilitating. So but in terms of just like on a normal week, that would be what the staffing would be.
All right. Few questions in here. It's obviously a good presentation. A lot of people have a lot of questions about a program like this, so thank you. So Emma at Ottawa, currently, what is the level of involvement from property managers in the recruitment process? So i.e., are they engaged in approving the volunteers representing their buildings? Do they have a veto? Can they veto someone? They say, we don't want that person doing that? Or...
Yeah, so we don't specifically talk to the property. If we're going about it from just someone self-identifies, they apply to the website. If they're eligible, we're sending them information that basically sets the expectation that they need to have their property manager involved. Otherwise, what could happen is they get trained, and then if their property management's not on board, they have all this information, but they're not able to implement anything. If someone goes and asks their property manager and then they say, no, I don't want you to be part of the program, or I need more information, we provide more information at that time. But in terms of them getting express approval and then sending that approval letter to the city, that's not something that we currently require.
Yeah, it's more
but
the building just wants, do we want the program or do we not? And then that's more what they're signing off on.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Looks like from Trevor, if and when the Ontario Food and Organics Policy Statement comes into effect, is Toronto prepared to assist non-service multi-res properties to be in compliance? So, we've heard the province say, hey, it's kind of on the building to make sure that you're in compliance and doing this. And there's 45% of your buildings, or give or take, that you're not servicing.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think at present, I think a fair amount of those buildings might not even be getting any organics collection. So if they're on private service, that would be something that they would have to work with their collection contract on. But in terms of the city working directly with buildings, regardless of who their service provider is for this, that might not be something that comes necessarily from the 3 Rs program. So I'm not entirely sure, but I think that certainly is going to be an issue for the sector to address whenever that that policy statement is cross-referenced with what's actually happening in buildings. That'll be something that I'm sure that the city will want to assist in our own buildings with outreach, but I'm not sure what that would look like in terms of privately serviced buildings.
All right. Just being cognizant of time. It's 10 o'clock. So we've got one question in the chat, which we'll get to. And then what I'll do is I'll just ask if anyone wants or has any other follow-up questions. Thank you for bringing up that slide there, Alexander, of your contact information. So please contact Alexander. So last question we have from up in the chat from Lucy is, are any additional incentives required to get people more involved? I understand that buildings have expectations to be on city service, but most would not be bothered to get engaged, leaving that work to property managers. So I'm assuming when we say to get people more involved, that would be for the to have more people want to be a 3 Rs ambassador?
Yeah. So I think, yeah, kind of linking back to like the staffing hours and the scope that the program can have, we could spend more time trying to get as many buildings, regardless of their desire to be in the program, engaged. We can enhance services to the buildings that we already have, or some mix of the two. So that's always an issue to think about. We have a lot of buildings, and I think that the buildings that are less likely to want to be involved are probably closer to those buildings that might want to not be on city service. They might want to opt out based on total garbage volume. So we work with buildings that are engaged too, because that's kind of the capacity that we have. But in terms of incentivizing buildings to get engaged, part of it is that many buildings might not have a very good understanding that if they lowered their garbage volume, they would decrease the cost of waste collection to their buildings. So we've already incentivized it from the fee structure up, that if they reduce garbage, they'll reduce costs from like the property management end of it. In terms of residents, I think one of the ways that we can have residents want to be more engaged is that we provide them a better volunteer experience. So that would be things that we're addressing with working directly with the rental companies, but also working with buildings such as co-ops where people have a longer term stake in the success of a program and their building and its effect on residents. So it's kind of choosing what your focus is, because we can't do it all at once, but trying to be as effective as possible in the time that we have.
Okay, thanks. If you don't mind, stop sharing. I do see that Laura has
Sure.
her hand up though.
Yeah, I don't have a question. I don't have a question. I just wanted to say thank you to Alex. That was a really informative presentation. If you could send your presentation to Trevor, if you're comfortable with it being posted on the MWA multi-res site, I think I wouldn't mind coming back to some of those slides that you had. I found